be able to hop around a bit. I'm talking about best practices and some of my experiences, some of Jacob's experiences, and some other tips and tools to take into consideration. Also, do want to mention, as we're going through it, right, happy to take anybody that's on the calls as well, advice as far as best practices, things that they would recommend. It's always good to get more or less interactive feedback. So we are posting now, and I'm gonna hit the record button, and we will be started in just about 10 seconds. So grab the slide deck and hit the present screen. Today's gonna be, if you've been on our previous security advisor series, a little bit different today. We're gonna be hopping in more technical deep dive. So we're gonna use some slides along with the conversation today. So I will share my screen for that, but yeah, this is designed to be interactive discussion. So feel free to comment, add additional insight, feedback into your experiences as it relates to Microsoft security. And I'm gonna hop in here and present. One last thing, I just have to hit the record button. So all these fun tasks. So cool, we're here getting started talking about Microsoft security. First off, Jacob Julian, by the way, nice Hawaiian shirt here, Jacob.
Oh, thanks, that's my professional photo, Patrick.
I like it, I like it. Your hair's done nice. I think it's funny, like being at home every day. I think I'm not going into office with people, like you kind of just let your hygiene hair go and stuff, you know, so it looks nice and professional. So Jacob, a little bit of background. We both worked with each other at Duo, and you did a combination of sales engineering and a lot of architecture type work as well, right?
Yeah, that's correct, Patrick. I mean, I've done everything at Duo, from sales engineering, and then moved into lab and architectural roles where I maintained, managed, and built Linux and Windows server environments built on AWS for the most part. So a little bit of everything there.
And then prior to that, you worked at CMU.
Yeah, Central Michigan University, not Carnegie Mellon, as people like to think. But yeah, I was a server administrator at Central Michigan University, mostly focused on the Linux and Linux server management, but we always had Windows components as well. Very, hard to get away from that.
Yep. And then myself, I have a mildly technical background, combination of, was at Duo for 8 years, helping build sales engineering, helping with product development, working with customers with deployment, implementation. And then previous to that, worked for managed service providers and had my own managed service provider for a while. So have a lot of different hands-on experience across just about any environment. So this should be a fun conversation talking about Microsoft and some different best practices observations. And so I thought, hey, why not kick it off first and discuss a little bit about some of the threats that are commonly seen. And I think, one of the observations here as we're talking is time and time again, I think, Jacob, what we see when we were at Duo, when we're at Blumira, we interact with literally hundreds of customers every single couple of months, probably thousands in a year, is the basics a lot of times just aren't covered from a threat perspective, right? So
yeah, it's the low-hanging fruit that people sometimes overlook, and really that's where the bulk of the threats end up originating, at least in my experience.
Yep. I mean, and that's what I've seen as well throughout my history, is it's really basic things from a control perspective that are missed. So we're going to start with talking about some of the different areas of threat. And I think there's likely a list longer than this, right? But some common themes in which we see of where attacks are happening, where they're coming from, and what things they're taking advantage of. So if we hop through this, first off, I put misconfigurations on here. How many times have you seen an incident or a breach because something was misconfigured? I'm curious to hear what your experiences has been there and what's the most common things. And I think there's a combination of well, we were in identity, right? And we're also working in detection, but anything that comes to your mind? Put them on the spot.
No, that's fine. Sorry, I was on mute there for a second. I mean, when it comes to misconfigurations, I think it's a hard one because it's an area where you don't know that you're misconfigured sometimes until it's too late. So I've seen everything from default passwords that haven't been changed, right? That goes way beyond just Windows and Microsoft. But a lot of the time, it's I'm going to make this small change for a test or a dev environment, and I'm going to change it back later today, and then you never end up doing that. So I know, in my experience, I've seen, I'm just going to open RDP to this one IP address through my firewall just to test something, and I'm just going to do it temporarily, and then I'll fix it. I'll put it back, and sometimes that doesn't end up happening, right? It's those lapses in security for convenience that sometimes lead to permanent misconfigurations that you don't realize you have until it's unfortunate.
Yeah, I think even on the two-factor side, right? Like something like setting the user to bypass temporarily and then you forget is a good example. I think the RDP access, SMB access, RDP we see all the time, which is exactly what you say. Hey, I'm just going to use it for 1 second, get in there, do what I need to do, and then I'll shut it off. And what ends up happening is like another shiny thing where all in IT happens. We go chase after that and forget and to actually close up the big hole we opened. And so, yeah, very, very, very common. And then I think in the cloud side, right, same thing. A matter of, almost bypassing basic security practice and controls. And then I think as we go through some of these other things, right, credential compromise being a huge area of target for attackers, right? Whether it's password spraying, brute force, unusual logins, getting a known username and password from other accounts via dark web or other means. I gotta say dark web. I mean via the internet and public lists, right? It doesn't even have to be on the dark web, but I think that's the reality. Is like this stuff is relatively available and accessible, especially when people are reusing passwords across different accounts personally. Is a thought there. On the security bypass side, like any thoughts? And I think the next two kind of tie together theme-wise, privileged access and security bypass. But what comes to your mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like when we talk about PowerShell bypass in this case, what we're talking about is the PowerShell execution policy bypass, which is sometimes thought of as a security control, but it's more of a control in PowerShell so that administrators don't necessarily uh, accidentally do something more than they'd like, so they don't shoot themselves in the foot, so to say. But what we've seen is that a lot of malware tries to take advantage of these bypasses through the execution policy. And they'll do something almost like a fileless PowerShell attack where it will reach out and download malware and reach out to CNC servers using these PowerShell bypasses. But that's not the only way that you could get a compromise on a Windows machine by any means. And like you're alluding to, a lot of it comes down to too much access in too many places, right? Privileged access is given to anyone who asks for it at some places and some organizations we've worked with, right? Everyone is an admin on their own machine, and that can be its own spider web of complications. But when it comes to privileged access, right, I think that's something where you want to take into account the idea of least privilege. And it sounds obvious, but it's something that we see not enough organizations necessarily doing, right? And that's, does this person need to be a domain admin? Are we looking at who we're adding to certain high privileged groups, right? It might not even just be domain admin. It might be the enterprise admins group. It might be any of the other built-in groups or the ones that you've delegated control to in Active Directory. And we just need to be keeping an eye on these more than we are.
Yep. And that, I think too, I know this is Windows, but I think most of these things are actually relevant for the cloud side as well, which we're talking a little bit about. Like, it doesn't change much the types of attacks as you move to a cloud infrastructure. I think in some cases there's good tools to help monitor a little bit more than doing it on your own. Is the reality.
Yep.
And then I think on the expanding a little bit as we're talking about host itself, right? Like the exploits and concepts of ransomware nowadays. I mean, the number one thing I see is people consistently getting hit with ransomware attacks, which is in the news and all over the place. But it's that's more of a reality of you know, people are basically running extortion attacks to try and make money.
Yeah. And
there.
don't pay if you're on this call. You know, don't pay. Our CTO is very adamant of that. Yeah, organizations should never pay ransoms because it just encourages the behavior more, and you get larger ransomware schemes. And of course, that relies on having adequate and tested backups, which we'll talk about in a little bit later. But
Cool. And then, yeah, I think there's a lot of common techniques and tactics like Blue Keep, which ties back to RDP access and Cobalt Strike. That also, you know, can go detected within Windows. And then, I think I'm always on the ransomware side. It's always funny because I've always been a big fan of Bitcoin, as you know, and so it's kind of interesting to see adoption of cryptocurrency increasing and prices increasing while we're also seeing increases in ransomware. Not sure that that's correlated, but probably has something to do with it as well, as that becomes more and more valuable. So yeah, I think on the Microsoft security side, sorry I labeled some of these things as Windows. We're talking a little bit broader than that. But a lot of things you can do are directly related to Windows. So we'll hop in and out of discussion there. There's really three things we're going to focus on: prevention, detection, and then best practices as far as some of the things you can do on the detection side. And I'd say best practices, on the prevention side, we're talking about that as well. So first off, Windows security, and time again, I think I always see every environment has some level of not having these controls in place. And so this is where I think it's like getting to the basics, and not just talking Windows, talking cloud as well, where there's really some fundamental controls that you can do and put in place that really reduce risk and mitigate a lot of the problems that are most likely to result in an incident for an organization. And yeah, it's tough a lot of times just to wrap your arms around it for a lot of organizations because there's so much going on. So you want to walk through a little bit about your thoughts on and you can run through maybe each of these and we can talk about them.
yeah, I mean, on the strong authentication, the one that we don't have written down here, but I was just thinking of as we're talking about this, is there's a lot of things that are included in Microsoft's security stack these days, both on-premises AD and cloud-based controls. But the one on-premises that I always encourage people to look at and to take advantage of is the LAPS product or feature. And that's the local administrator password solution, which for all of your servers or workstations and such, automatically rotates and creates a complex password for the built-in local administrator accounts. And that's a free tool that's included, and it's pretty simple to set up. So I would say, you know, if there's a takeaway on that, right, you can leverage that. That's something that's included with Microsoft Stack, and it's one that we always encourage. There's also a lot of areas where you could use multi-factor today. Even for, you know, if you look at the Azure cloud stack, right, it's free to use for administrator accounts and for privileged accounts there. So there's really no reason to not enable that and to use that. So I know, you know, some people have mixed feelings on rotating passwords, right, based on NIST and their recommendations. And I don't think that you should necessarily rotate passwords just for the sake of rotating them because you're bored or because the day is Wednesday. But I do think that there can be a legitimate value to doing that. But more so, I think, right, encouraging users and administrators to use complex but legible passwords, something like passphrases over a password or a random character. Of course, you always have password management tools like LastPass and 1Password, or there's a handful out there. Even some open source tools that you could use to work on that.
And I think the thing, and there's a few comments which I think are really good, relevant to number one, the ransomware payment. Earlier, Bill says DOT regulations. If you pay ransomware, you're subject to fines for those that facilitate payments. So that's newer. Absolutely, that's another reason why you probably want to reconsider if you're considering making them a ransomware payment. But then more on this topic, right, is how does that integrate with team-based password managers? And I think there's a combination there of privileged access tool like PAM, like CyberArk, Thycotic, and those sorts of tools.
Secret server.
And not, the other thing to keep in mind is not everyone can have two-factor on it. And just because it has two-factor on it, we all know, it doesn't mean that two-factor can't be bypassed. And a good example of that is like Exchange. If you're using Exchange on premise, without using modern authentication, would basically, it's still accessible via the mobile port. And I'm spacing on what that is. Like O is going to be protected.
ActiveSync.
ActiveSync essentially leaves a wide open hole, and we would see this time and time again, where people didn't really take that into consideration. So Chad, good question on the team-based password managers. And then I think the other important thing is making sure you have two-factor into those password managers as well. So you are limiting that risk if it's only a single password protected, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, what about Windows hardening?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, right, we talk about low-hanging fruit and we talk about what people aren't doing. We know that they're not exactly patching Windows servers or workstations as much as we probably should be. And that's, there's some value in not being the first to enable a Microsoft patch. I will be the first to admit that I'm not going to necessarily rush on every patch Tuesday and push this out to all of my servers and prod right away. But I think that we as an organizational group of admins, right, need to be better at making sure that we are patching more regularly. A lot of the attacks and a lot of the threats that we talk about are simply negated by patching, and it's not even inclusive of, or all inclusive of Windows, right? That can include Mac, that can include browsers. For instance, there's a couple months ago, I think I remember there being a 0-day for Chrome that was pretty bad, and it's a simple matter of just updating the service. And that's true for Windows, that's true for the software on Windows, but all of that needs to be something that you make a regular point to create a schedule for, test before you push it out to critical servers, right? The SQL server might react differently than one that's just a simpler file server, right? When it comes to these patches. But that's something I think that is probably the biggest easier takeaway that I've had in the last few years is just that we need to patch more. We need to update more regularly, and we need to be better on that front. And then there's a lot of really good disk encryption FDE tools built in, right? And you're talking, oh man, the name is escaping me right now. What's the built-in one for Windows?
BitLocker?
BitLocker, yes. I
right.
blanked on it, man. That's that's embarrassing. Yeah, I mean, BitLocker is included in Windows these days, right? And it's as good as any for a disk encryption tool. And a lot of people, right, Patrick, we know they used to talk to us about, well, if I want to have Duo or multi-factor on my workstation, we'd simply say, well, if the disk is the disk encrypted, because otherwise I might just rip it out and read from right from the disk. And that's something where, and I have a little bit of background in healthcare IT as well, right? And at least I think this is still true, but years ago it used to be if you had a data breach of patient information, say a laptop, but that laptop was encrypted, you didn't necessarily have to report it as a breach that had a fine associated with it, as long as it was encrypted and the data wasn't accessible. Now, if you had a sticky note inside of it with the password for that system, it was a little different story, but the value of disk encryption can't be understated. And there's too many easy options today to not make that a priority.
Yes. I mean, that's one thing. I'm personally, I as you kind of saw when I shared my screen, I use Mac. It is nice to see, right? Everything's disk encrypted by default to start nowadays. And same thing with our mobile, your mobile phone devices as well. I think Android depends on the platform, and that's because the operating system is separated from the actual hardware itself, right?
Yeah.
And then, I think the other thing on the hardening side is Windows Firewall, which is, a good base control that's going to prevent some things like lateral movement potentially.
Yeah, it's another layer,
Yep.
Yeah.
From a security perspective.
No silver bullet, right, Patrick? It's all about the layers of security and making it harder in a lot of cases. It's you don't want to be the easiest target on the block.
No.
That's kind of how I think of it.
Yeah, and then segmentation. Segmentation, I think, applies both your cloud infrastructure as well as on premise, right? It's just making sure that you're not all in the same VLAN. Everything's not accessible. Leveraging a firewall, especially for externally facing, proper use of DMZs, and then you can get into a whole aspect of network and micro segmentation. I mean, it's a rabbit hole and it's complicated.
Zero trust.
There's a reason behind that, right? I think there are some tools out there that have made that easier. However, it's still a complicated problem for a lot of organizations to tackle. So some things to take into consideration there, but everything shouldn't be on a flat network, and we still see many organizations operating on a flat network. And so layering in segmentation properly there. And then I think the last thing from a prevention perspective is having good backups.
Not just having them, but testing them too.
Testing. Oh man, I got a story on the testing side, because I have seen a scenario where backups were happening for years, and then when they went to restore, the backups don't actually work, right? And that's an all too unfortunate reality, and happens quite often.
Yeah. No, I mean, your backups are only as good as the last known test, right? And I think that's something that people oftentimes skip.
Yep. If we hop to detection, and I was debating where we put EDR and antivirus, but I think more or less on the detection side, right? And so there's a few things to take into consideration, which is, and maybe I should have put this one first. It's yes, you should have an EDR /AV / whatever you want to call these different endpoint tools nowadays. The Carbon Blacks, the CrowdStrikes, the Silences, and then complementary to or if you don't have the resources for those products, Windows Defender comes free with Windows. I think in discussion, and talked a little bit about this last week with Bo Bullock, is the EDR and Windows Defender are very complementary, right? When used properly together. So I think that's an important step from a kind of prevention detection perspective, from a tools aspect. And then we really start getting into the logging side of things, right? Which gets kind of interesting. First off, many organizations don't even have a way to centralize logs across the Microsoft environment or across their environment as a whole. So log aggregation becomes really important. And I think first off, getting centralized visibility into the events. And if we talk about events, Windows specifically and event IDs provide a ton of information for you to look into security risk and threats, right? And then across the cloud stack with Azure, Office 365, and then in some cases, right, customers that own some of the more advanced licensing sets with E5, Office 365, ATP, I'm sorry, they're all called Defender now.
It changes weekly, so.
Yeah, but yeah, those products enhance and provide great value in the area of detection, right? That a lot of times get overlooked because of cost. Is the main thing where people don't opt to necessarily purchase them, and they do provide value.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think of, if you want to think of the net logon or zero logon vulnerability, I think that originated maybe in August, which seems like an eternity ago, but I guess it was only 3 months or so. There are, a certain event IDs after you installed the August patch that you want to monitor to see if those connections are happening that are vulnerable connections. And those event IDs are, there's probably, I think there's 4, 5, maybe 6 of them. And you want to audit your domain controller connections and the authentications, and you want to be looking for those. And that's hard if you don't necessarily have a centralized logging tool or something to help with that.
Yeah, and then I think the other things is the fact that, and this goes along not only with Windows but also with the cloud apps, as we kind of see with their limited logging. But Microsoft tends to not default to having real verbose logging as it relates specifically to Windows, and we'll talk a little bit about how to address that. And then also, even with their cloud applications and their APIs, they don't make it particularly easy to navigate getting to depth from a visibility perspective. And so there's some steps that you can take to get more verbosity and more visibility. And on the Windows side too, we'll talk a little bit about this, but Sysmon as well as a place that can help give you more of that visibility.
Yep.
And then the last thing, right, is once you actually have that information, then focusing on detection of common threats. And I think what's particularly here is getting to high value where you're detecting things that are known or maybe anomalies, and getting visibility into, hey, this could be a security problem. This also could be an operational problem, but the main thing there is that it has to be high value and low noise, because the second it just starts creating a ton of noise, human nature is just to kind of shut off and go focus on something different when there's no value. So there's definitely a balance that goes on there when you're talking about the actual detection portion of detecting things based on logging and security events. All right, this is all you. Centralized and increase window. No, Microsoft logging. Yeah, first off, I think if you want to share some of your experiences on Event Viewer and difference of centralizing that, any thoughts on what you see a lot of people doing and kind of struggling through?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, like, there's no strategy, right, when it comes to how am I going to look at my Windows logs, or what do I care to look at. A lot of people don't have, I would say, in fact, most people, rightfully so, don't have the event IDs for certain circumstances memorized. And I would never blame you for not memorizing those.
For those of you that memorize event IDs, throw your favorite one in the comments section.
Yeah. We'll put it on a wheel and we'll spin it afterwards.
Well, yeah, we'll see if Jacob can guess what it is.
That's what Google's for. Yeah. But I mean, something that a lot of people don't know is that, security events from one domain controller aren't necessarily going to be replicated by default to the other domain controller. So if you're looking for maybe an account lockout, that can be really hard if you don't have centralized logging, because if you have if you're a large enterprise maybe and you have many domain controllers, or you've got a read-only domain controllers as well that you throw in there, you're going to be going from machine to machine, looking at each of those event viewer logs, trying to find some semblance of what you're looking for. And it's hard to really correlate that with other logs. And on the left-hand side here, right, we've got a event viewer screenshot, and then Patrick's got a view of the Blumira product on the right-hand side here, where we have pre-built reports, and it's for certain things that you might be really interested in. And then it's also very easily done to just replace the event IDs with what you're looking for. If you are looking for a certain event ID that corresponds to a certain area of interest, or a vulnerability that gets logged or patched with a Microsoft patch like the netlogon stuff, you can find that in here pretty easily, and you can correlate that across different domain controllers, and also correlate those logs with maybe Azure AD logs or Office 365 if you're trying to trace down a YA password, or YA password keeps getting denied and logging or locking someone's account out. I think the log correlation and actually solving real business problems is where having centralized logging comes into play, versus just going from domain controller to domain controller, looking at individual event IDs and event viewers to try to find, did something happen? It goes beyond did it happen, and it goes to maybe why is this happening, and what are the patterns? How many times is this happening, and what are the anomalies?
Yeah, and I do think it's kind of interesting. Like we've had several organizations that didn't even have centralized logging, and essentially realized like, oh wow, all those help desk functions of password resets I can become more proactive around. Like them trying to hop between logging into different domain controllers to figure out and troubleshoot a problem. Like those are the sorts of things that are more operational than security. But then I think also like getting visibility into, oh wow, there's a bunch of failed user login attempts happening in certain areas, which a lot of times is associated with misconfiguration of software or old software, right? And nobody realizes it. So like you don't, like it creates it eliminates your baseline of failed authentications, for example. So it's even hard to tell if there really is a problem within your environment. So there's some aspect of doing some level of hygiene management across your infrastructure that becomes important with those things. And that's not only with Windows, that's also with your O365, your Azure AD, and other areas within your stack, right? That have identity.
And I think too, a lot of the time, people don't necessarily know if an account is silently failing to authenticate, if it's something like a scheduled task, right, that's running on a utility server, or doing something along those lines to run a job every so often. And a lot of the times I've seen where that will fail because maybe the admin is running it under their credential, and that credential changed, or they left the company. And so now you've got not only this account that is racking up failed login attempts, which is its own thing, but also you have whatever that scheduled task was doing is now failing to run. And that can be its own issue above and beyond just account lockouts.
Yep. All right, so hopping on a little bit further, once we have centralized logs, broad log collection, right? So here's just a grab from a group policy, right? And just show an example of there's many different security and audit related logs that do not get configured by default. And so if you don't change these, you're not going to get visibility into things at a host level or a centralized perspective that can help you get visibility into real risk within your environment. And so there's kind of two things. You can either go in and manually change about 150 different criteria. And what ended up happening here is Amanda Berlin, on our security team, does this with like every customer, and finally was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna go crazy doing this. And so she ended up creating oh wait, sorry, there's nothing with default Windows. It's very limited, right? From a visibility perspective. And so this isn't even related to necessarily us at Blumira saying, hey, go install our software because it will give you more visibility, regardless of what product you use for detection and centralized logging, basically you need to do this step or you're going to limit your potential for success and potential for detection. And so you have to go in and essentially modify a GPO to put the right controls in place so you do get that visibility so you can detect off those things. And yeah, there's a combination of different areas as far as where you're applying this. But here's an example of some of all the baseline recommendations that aren't enabled by default. And so you can look at the list that we have and you can go do that. And I think there's maybe some third parties that also provide a list recommendation, but nobody really does that. Or like they get a quarter of the way through, they have ADHD like me, and then they just go on to the next task, right? There's a common theme, I think, with like with setting up RDP connections and then going and doing something else. Yeah.
Go grab lunch.
Yeah, I mean, high amount of ADHD in IT.
I think too that this kind of goes back around to what we were talking about earlier, and it's while this isn't a misconfiguration, it is a default, right? And people assume the defaults are good and that they're useful, and that is something that maybe as a profession we should expect that and we should ask for more as far as defaults go, but it's not the case necessarily. So you might think that you're getting useful logging from your Windows devices and servers through the defaults, but you might not be. And the time to find out that you're not isn't after an incident when you're trying to track down certain event IDs or events that turns out had to be enabled prior. So it's like Patrick said, I mean, this GPO template is super easy to install and apply to your servers or your whatever OU you'd like. It's not exclusive to Blumira.
Yeah, we call it Logmira. It is on GitHub, just so everyone's aware that's on the call today. You can download it for free. You don't even have to be a Blumira customer. So highly recommend considering that. There also now is a light version because it does take up some level of resources on a server or infrastructure, right? To do additional logging. And so there's a light, I can't remember what we call it, but if you go to GitHub, you'll see a light version as well, which has like more or less minimal things you should implement no matter what. That doesn't require as much from a resource perspective on the logging note. So, all right, next up, we have Sysmon. Jacob, you want to talk a little bit about Sysmon and its value?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Patrick. So Sysmon is a really interesting tool. It's part of the sysinternals package. So it's something that we always recommend our customers who are interested in Microsoft logging taking advantage of. It enriches the standard Windows logs, and it produces a higher level of monitoring of some events like process creation, network connections, and changes that might be happening to the file system. Installing it's super simple. You just run the executable for it, and then we've got a recommended configuration file that you would put in its place. And it's actually a really great way of getting, like I said earlier, a deeper level of more useful information from Windows. So knowing, not only what processes are being ran and logging that, but also when are they, when did they end? What's the executable or binary that's running itself? Where are the hashes? All of that, it makes it easy to see if maybe malicious code is trying to hide itself or mimic a legitimate program like PowerShell or another Microsoft tool. So it really is like giving a magnifying glass to what is actually happening on a machine. Tremendous amounts of value in installing Sysmon. I think it should be part of a standard install package when it comes to Windows logging and monitoring. That's just touching the surface of what it can do.
Cool. So installing that in addition to the GPO settings
Yep.
Is certainly going to give you more visibility from a detection perspective. Oh man, I forgot to build a slide out for Windows Defender. Any comments on Windows Defender? I think the major thing, from my perspective, it's a free tool.
Yeah.
That is going to give, it's going to detect real aspects in block, some low hanging fruit as it relates to potential malware on the hosts themselves, right?
I think it's a pretty good option these days, especially if you're using the centralized managed version for ATP. If you don't have something in place today, I think that Windows Defender in the last few years has made excellent strides. There's at least from what I've seen, no reason to not give it a shot if you're not using anything today. I think it is leagues better than nothing, and put some of the other products for a run for their money. So I'm a big fan of Windows Defender. I think it is a pretty good tool. Highly encourage you to at least take a look at it if you're not using something today.
Yep. Hey, and even talking with people, even if you're using an EDR, right? Most people I've talked to are like, you still want to consider using this complementary to that tool. There's, I think, a little bit of overlap that like maybe adjustment wise you need to consider.
You'll want to make sure they're not, they're not scanning each other's directories, because you can get some conflict there and it can run up the CPUs, but that's standard for running two of anything.
Sweet. Cool. Hey, so I think we have about 15 minutes. Oh, there was a question around Defender. Can it be centrally managed? There's two things I'm going to answer to that. Number one is like Windows Defender on its own is not centrally managed. But if you buy Windows Defender for endpoints, formerly known as Windows Defender ATP, which is part of the E5 licensing, then you can centrally manage it. Alternatively, for us, we've had customers that have Windows Defender and not ATP, and they want visibility into that it's being run and operate. There are ways to get reporting to show that Windows Defender is on the hosts and running. Not saying that's giving you like full management capabilities, but it does give you some aspect of visibility to say like, hey, at least this is on the host and it ran at some point. And sometimes that's what's needed. I think in that case, customer had requirements via maybe PCI to show that they had a tool running on the device to detect malware. And that was the way they did it. So I'm not necessarily recommending that as best practice, but that is a good example of how I've seen someone leveraging the value within our product to get visibility into Defender. Outside of Defender ATP and Microsoft Defender for endpoints.
Yeah, we got a whole webinar on Microsoft naming conventions and licensing too, but nobody wants to go to that.
Yeah, if everyone didn't know, right, they changed all the ATP products, which is Azure ATP, Defender ATP, Office 365 ATP, basically took all those and put the word Defender in there somewhere now. So there's like Defender for Office 365. And I think the naming convention makes sense, and they're all really good products. They do a great job at providing more pointed detection and visibility, and definitely are something to consider from a product perspective, recommending those. So feel free to ask any questions. We're going to hop into, and Jacob's going to hop into demo from a Blumira perspective. How Blumira works is essentially helping automate security operations, log ingestion, parsing, threat intelligence, correlation, pre-built detection rules, alerting, prioritization, and then helping automate some of the security operations workflows and providing playbooks on what to do. And then there's the aspect of Cloud SIEM, which is really getting into log collection and automation of reporting and providing you reports to get more visibility. And then we do backstop that with our product and security expertise as needed from a customer perspective. So I kind of mentioned a customer that needed the Defender reporting capabilities to show that they were running that. That's an example where a security analyst came in and just did that for them. And now that's available for all customers. So how our product works, right, is essentially integrates with your existing products. And then we surface, we automate detection and response, right, and surface threats detected, and then help you from an action perspective to be able to take action, either automated or by providing a playbook. So I'm gonna hop over to Jacob Julian. The content we kind of talked through today, and there's more. We do have a new guide to Microsoft security, which we published. If you go to our resources and white paper on our webpage, just want to point that out. Like, you should go check it out, download it. There's way more detail there as far as all the things we talked about, plus more, as far as tips and tools and things that you should consider as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Jacob to hop into the product a little bit more and just show some different examples as far as how Blumira works.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And I'll say before I share my screen here while I'm sharing this, that Microsoft guide is pretty good. I mean, I enjoyed it from a technical perspective. I thought there was a lot of meat to it. So if you're a technical person on this webinar right now and you're thinking, I don't necessarily want to download another marketing thing, I would say it's more of a technical guide than it is anything else. So just keep that in mind.
I almost thought it was too technical.
Well, that's it's all about perspective, maybe, you know. Yeah.
No, it's good. It's good. It's great.
Yeah.
I mean, it provides real, useful, impactful stuff, right? So
it sure does. So I'm hopped into the Blumira admin console right now. This is our hosted by Blumira software as a service platform. So in this case, I'm going to show you a little bit of some of the detections we might see related to the Windows ecosystem and environment, how you might respond to those as a responder in the program, and some of the impact of that. So the first one that I always like to talk about here is just this first one here. We have a suspected threat. So I'm going to assign myself as the responder for this. And what we did is the Blumira software found that a new domain account administrator or domain admin was created. We can also detect when existing accounts are moved into these privileged groups or these users are removed. So there's a lot that we can do there. At this point, though, we're not sure that this is a actual threat. So every detection that Blumira has, we have a nice workflow, a playbook for you. So in this case, we're saying, hey, for this instance, was this user legitimately created, or do we not know why this was created? And I can say, hey, we don't know how that was created. I'm not sure. So I'm going to select that and might have to refresh. Not sure about that. Yep, so there we go. Not sure what happened there. I'm going to select that. I'm not sure how this was created. I'm going to close this finding and create a priority one threat. So all of my responders are going to get alerted based on their notification settings. So in the system, you can choose how you want to be notified, right? Not everyone wants to get a phone call in the middle of the night just because a user was removed or added to a certain group. So just note that we have voice, text, email for different priorities, different notification types, including operational and system notifications. If I go back to that now, I can see that, hey, we've determined that there's a rogue domain admin account that's been created, and very quickly we allow you to a lot of places will delegate this work down. So you might not have a security engineer that you work with. You may be the security engineer, but you might also have or be a generic systems or network administrator, in which case maybe you can delegate some of this work down. We are able to do that because we have simple to follow workflows. So in this case, we give you the PowerShell to run to disable that AD account that you just told us that you didn't know how it was created. And if I have any questions about a finding or a detection in the product, right inside of the product itself, I can communicate to Blumira's security analyst and security engineering team. So this is something that we include with the product as just access to our security experts. And in this case, it's a pretty basic use case, right? An admin was created, but for more advanced detections and for more advanced scenarios, you might want to run something by or ask us about a certain finding. And you have that ability to do that right inside of the product. So I'm going to close this and say, yep, that was, we don't know what happened there, but we ran that and we are all set now. We can do similar ones, as you can see here, for G Suite, cloud-based applications and identity programs as well. One thing that's always interesting is if you are using an endpoint detection response program or an AV, right? And there's a lot of this that we can detect even without that. Something like in this case, credential harvesting through the Mimikatz tool. In this case, we detected that via endpoint AV logs, but there are a few different ways that we could detect malicious software running on a Windows machine and surface that to you in a very similar way. The one other finding I wanted to talk about here is just to simply, hey, we're seeing password spraying against our AnyConnect system. And of course, if you're running a VPN platform, there's 99% chance that that's connected to Active Directory, right? So by looking at both the firewall, the VPN concentrator logs, and Active Directory, we can correlate actions as they're happening. And in this case, you can see all of the matched evidence for how we came to a determination that password spraying was occurring. And so while we might be doing password spraying here, and maybe it's just enough login attempts for each account to not trigger a lockout, right? But this is still something where we want to be aware of this. We want to know about this because this can create problems down the road if this does actually work, right, from a credential stuffing or password spraying point of view. So in this case, we simply identified it. We give you the IP address that we're seeing it from, and we can automatically block the source IP address of that using dynamic block lists. So if you're running a next-gen firewall, something like an ASA, a Firepower, Checkpoint, Palo Alto, and there's a couple more, I believe. If your firewall supports dynamic block lists, we can easily configure the Blumira product to automatically block some of those connections as we see them and as they come across our threat feeds. We have built-in threat feeds in the product from a number of different sources, and then we can automate those actions as well. So if I wanted to, I might say, hey, if I have the option of blocking this malicious IP address that is just blatantly doing a password spraying attempt on me right now, and it's matching on our threat feed, so we know this is malicious, I might want to automatically take action and block that so that I don't have to necessarily worry about it. As soon as it's identified, that starts to become something that I can block. So tremendous amount of value there. We see the password spraying happen a lot of the time on VPNs, right? But also on various Microsoft systems directly, like on-premise Exchange, Office 365 itself. All of those are ripe for password spraying, especially if you're using a federation server like ADFS. That's something where those events are going to be in your event viewer, and you're going to be able to very easily identify that. One thing I want to do is just very quickly show you here. I talked a little bit about the beginning here, and then I'll show you this one thing, and then we'll wrap up, do any quick Q&A. But you can explore the data in Blumira very easily. We have a number of pre-built searches here, and let me move my my search bar here. But as you can see, we have global searches that are created. And in this case, right, one that we've created is this NetLogon secure channel connections, which is doing exactly what I talked about earlier, where it's looking for those event IDs related to the zero logon vulnerability. So those are going to be 5827, 5828, 30, 31, and 29, right? And it's really easy in this case to filter through those. And there's not going to be any data here in our demo for this. But one thing I wanted to show you is how easily you can look across all of the domain controllers and all of the logging in a centralized way. You can look at the event IDs that you care about, and we help you with some pre-built reports for like account lockouts, failed logins, accounts created, things like that. But there's a lot more you can find here. I was working with someone yesterday who was interested in looking at their Office 365 platform and SharePoint, OneDrive, and they're interested in just having a regular report of all of the files that might have been deleted or shared externally. And so, it's very easy to get that information when you have that information already in the product, which is what we're doing here. And it takes us all 5 minutes to integrate with Domain Controller and Office 365 using the API for 365. So not only do we do detections on some of the most impactful things that will be a risk to your Windows environment or Microsoft environment. This goes beyond Windows, but also we give you access to the data here and however many ways you want to filter that, right? And it's very easy to do that using the product. So a little bit easier than going from domain controller to domain controller, looking at each event viewer log. At least I like to think so. So we've got a few minutes left here. Patrick, is there anything you'd like to add? Or we can also do any Q&A if there is any, but let me take a look at the chat here. All right, I'm not seeing anything. So Patrick,
Oh, sorry, I was muted.
I was going to say, if you're talking, you're on mute, but I didn't want to put you on the spot there.
Oh, and I hid my video when you were talking. I was,
that's all right. Figured late lunch maybe.
World. Yeah. No, it's been great. No, I think it's awesome. Just high level overview to share with everyone. Like, take some of the Windows best practice tips and tricks we talked about. Go check out the Microsoft Security Guide. If you go to our resources white paper, that's an amazing resource overall as well. And I would just say it's like, just be super mindful of block and tackling the basics. My advice always is like, if you do the basics right, you're really going to limit from a risk perspective things that can be introduced from an organization perspective. So appreciate everybody on the call today. In 2 weeks from today, we are going to have another Blumira series. I don't think I have the invite built yet. Probably built tomorrow or Monday, and that's going to be on the OT environment specifically. And more or less how to do SIM detection and response with an operational technology environment. So, that's particularly useful for organizations that might be in manufacturing, oil and gas, or using any type of operational technology environments and want to ensure that they limit their risk. So, thanks to everybody for coming on today. Thanks, Jacob, for hopping on and talking about some of your experiences and recommendations from a best practice perspective.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Patrick, and thank you all for joining today. Once again, that Microsoft Security Guide is available for download on the website. I highly encourage you all to take a look there.
Oh, wait, there's another question. A link to how to manage Defender using SCCM and Intune. So yes, I didn't take into that consideration. That's a good other example of how you could leverage that with other Microsoft tools. Thanks, Mike.
Absolutely.
Take care, everybody.
All right,
have a good day and a good weekend.